I should have waited to shoot this last. This is bourbon. America's spirit. Just like Scotch can only be made in Scotland and champagne can only be made in the Champagne region of France, bourbon can only be made in the United States. Also, it has a little something to do with nuns. Yep, those nuns. So much so that without Catholics in a tiny little area of Kentucky, we might not even have bourbon at all. I'm Ryan O'Hare, Bright Trip contributor, and today we're going to find out what on earth nuns have to do with bourbon. Let's start with what makes bourbon, well, bourbon. Bourbon is, as I said, America's spirit, and it typically comes from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Although in recent years we've seen distilleries pop up all over the country. It has to be made from fermented sour mash of at least 51% corn and stored in never before used charred oak barrels, giving it a sweet caramel color and smoky flavor. But bourbon didn't always have these rules. In fact, bourbon wasn't even called bourbon until the late 1800s. And where it got its name is up for debate. But before this, it was just whiskey, grain alcohol, white dog, or moonshine. And a lot had to happen for this spirit to come to be. See, long before bourbon was a thing, before Kentucky was a thing, and before the United States of America was even a twinkle in Uncle Sam's eye, we had this little movement in Europe called the Protestant Reformation. Catholics and other non-Anglican denominations faced persecution in England. So, seeking the freedom to worship as they wanted, many chose to leave and settle land in the New World. So, in 1632, this white guy, King Charles, gave this other white guy, George Calvert, permission to settle land already occupied by, well, these non-white people. And with that, the colony of Maryland was created with the understanding that it was pretty much a colony for Catholics. Obviously, this drew in a hefty number of Catholic settlers, and soon Maryland had the highest concentration of Catholics in the whole 13 colonies. The tolerance of Catholicism didn't last long, though. More and more people of Anglican and Protestant faith flooded the colony, and a bloody rebellion to overthrow the Catholic governor was led by this guy, John Coode. They succeeded, and with the passage of anti-popery laws, Catholics had to worship in secret for nearly 100 years. Now, it is worth noting that, historically, Catholics have not been the most accepting of faiths. Think the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition, even some modern day stuff. But even still, it was made super difficult for them to practice their faith in Maryland. So, a lot of them decided to pack up and in true American fashion, head west for better fortunes. To Kentucky, or well, Virginia at the time. By the way, Virginia was massive back then. The region now known as Kentucky today is not what you would consider the Wild Wild West. Some say it's the South, some say it's the Midwest. It is 100% the South, don't let anyone tell you differently. But in the late 1700s, it's as wild as they come. And it wasn't until this guy, Daniel Boone, blazed a trail through the Cumberland Gap that Kentucky was really accessible in the first place. Prior to that, you had to go a whole 200 or 300 miles further, out of the way, up to Pittsburgh, and then down the Ohio River to access Kentucky. Needless to say, it was still a rough journey. Through the Appalachian Mountains, over rivers, and through the woods to grandmother's house we go. The whole time, one had to be on the lookout for Native Americans who, were fighting against displacement and for the right to stay on their ancestral grounds. Shortly after the American Revolution, seeking better fortunes and more religious freedom, a league of 60 Catholic families from St. Mary's, Maryland, made a pact to settle in and around what is now Nelson County, Kentucky. That first group of 25 families to set out on the voyage was led by Basil Hayden. Yes, my friends, this Basil Hayden. Starting to see a connection? They decided to take the northern route to Pittsburgh, down the Ohio, presumably because it was far more traveled and established than the newer Wilderness Road. But it was no easy journey. In fact, Basil Hayden and his wife lost 4 of their 9 children along the way. They eventually settled near Pottinger's Creek in Nelson County, Virginia, and were soon joined by the remaining families of the League. Okay, what about the nuns? Well, As a result of the good soil, access to water, and natural protection provided by the rolling hills of Kentucky, so many Catholic families moved to the 3 counties of Marion, Nelson, and Washington that the area became known as the Kentucky Holy Land. So, with such a large concentration of Catholics in one area of the frontier, the Catholic Church, and in particular the Diocese of Baltimore, had to listen when they asked for spiritual leadership. And I think now is a good time to discuss Catholics and their history with alcohol. See, these two are no strangers. For one, wine is central to the sacrament of the Eucharist or communion at every Mass. Trappist monks all across Europe are well known for their beer making. And one Benedictine monk in particular had such an impact on the creation of champagne that his name is plastered on one of the most well-known bottles of champagne out there, Dom Perignon. And Catholics, while not overindulgent per se, were more than tolerant of the manufacture and consumption of alcohol, leading to the boom in distilleries, breweries, and wineries in their presence. So, in 1787, Basil Hayden granted land from his farm, where he was actively distilling his own whiskey, to build Holy Cross, the first Catholic church west of the Appalachian Mountains. If you take a look at some of the names in the graveyard, you'll see families that have been an integral part of this region since the area was settled. And it's a veritable who's who of the bourbon world. There's Haydens, Dance, Beams, Willett, Wheatley. So, over the next few years, the power and prominence of the Catholics in this region grew and grew. And in 1805, nuns and priests of the Dominican order arrived. They would go on to build St. Dominic's Church, St. Dominic's School, St. Catherine College, St. Catherine Mother House, St. Catherine Girls Academy, St. Rose Priory, St. Thomas Church, and St. Thomas Seminary, among many others. In 1808, Bardstown in Nelson County, Kentucky was selected to house the new Diocese of Bardstown, with a bishop and a cathedral to oversee the entire area stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River and north to the Great Lakes. And in 1810, Trappist monks fled Napoleon in France to form Gethsemane Abbey. And in 1812, 2 more convents were formed, the Sisters of Loretto and the Sisters of Nazareth. And they kept on coming. Now, let's take a look where 6 of the biggest brands in distilling are located. It's no coincidence that many of the major bourbon distillers are located right here. In this way, the liberal tolerances of Catholics when it came to alcohol led to the growth of the bourbon industry. And while you won't see bourbon in the communion cup at Sunday Mass, Catholicism and bourbon are tightly intertwined into the culture of the Kentucky Holy Land. Catholics also share a bit of the credit for the spread of bourbon outside this area and across America. As the U.S. continued to push westward, the nuns of the Sisters of Loretto followed, and they continued to be based in Loretto, Kentucky, at the center of the Kentucky Holy Land, but built schools, churches, and Catholic communities as they spread westward. So with the wide-reaching growth of Catholicism in the Southwest, it's possible that their tolerance of alcohol contributed to the spread and adoption of bourbon as America's spirit. Catholics were even responsible for bourbon's survival before, during, and after Prohibition. After the Civil War, Protestant denominations began to push hardline Prohibition views and policies. And while Catholics didn't necessarily promote alcohol, they didn't turn their back either. The few Protestants left in bourbon, like Elijah Craig, left the distilling business and opened the door for more Catholic investment, ultimately keeping the business alive. Prohibition then forced the closure of many distilleries that didn't have permission to operate for medicinal purposes. Very few distilleries survived from pre-Prohibition because of this. After it was repealed, Catholics jumped back into the game, bringing back the bourbon business. They started new distilleries, revived old ones, brought innovation to a dead industry. Today, you can still visit many of these sites. Holy Cross is still a functioning church, and not far away you can see the fermenting barrels at Maker's Mark that are so old they're on the National Register of Historic Places. The Abbey of Gethsemane is well known for their use of bourbon in the fruitcakes, fudges, and other baked goods they produce. And the recent boom in bourbon demand has led to an immense amount of investment in restaurants, hotels, distilleries, all in this area. So much so that many are calling it the Napa Valley of bourbon. And it's safe to say that without the Catholic migration to the Kentucky Holy Land, we may not have bourbon at all, or at least not the way we know it today. And this stuff, bourbon, owes a lot to this. Nuns, monks, priests. If you're planning a trip to bourbon country, the real Napa Valley, or anywhere really, Bright Trip will give you all the info you need. They have amazing tips on how to travel, how to document your trip, and destination-specific courses that prepare you to have the best trip ever. As a newer parent, one of my favorites is the course How to Travel with Kids by Iz and Johnny Harris. They give you tips from their years of experience as travel journalists traveling with their kids. Visit brighttrip.com for more details, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more travel tips and information on some of the most interesting travel destinations around the globe. Thanks.